My name is Drexia, and this will be a presentation on the key elements of Evict. In this video, we'll be going over some of the very important features of Evict. First, starting with what actually is eviction. We'll be then looking at the terminology used throughout this video, schematics, what are they, how they're used. Then we'll be looking at a brief history of Evict and why it's important to know this history and what it can tell us about the game. Then we'll be going to the advanced section. We'll be looking at the stages of gameplay, a new concept I've come up with called win conditions, unit dynamics, defense dynamics, terrain dynamics, and finally my hopes and dreams in terms of balancing for the future. So to begin with, I guess it's best to talk about what is Evict. So Evict is a industry server hosted by the YouTuber and player Lara Feedicus. It is a PvP style server in the Hextime, but with many unique rules which change and enhance gameplay. More on this in the terminology segment. Evict is a game where two or more players are spawned in separate hexes, and there they must build and grow. So they do this by using units to take more hexes as they fight for dominance of the map. In order for a player to win, they must capture all hexes along the way and may recruit any player who they defeat, giving them a better chance and an easy time at world domination. The map itself uses a random terrain generation system, and many interesting features appear as a result of this. This is a video about specifically the Erekir version. There is a second server for Sepulu eviction, but that is not relevant in this video. I myself have always focused on Erekir, so it is the area I'm more knowledgeable about, which is why. So these are some screenshots from a typical game. On the first column on the left, we see what hexes look like, how the ore generation layout results in things like that. In the middle column, we see what an opening hex may look like, and what kind of a second hex might typically look like a little bit later in the game. On the right, the top right, we see a fairly late game image, and bottom right we see a very late game image. So what does it take to get good at Evict and be able to create those hexes for yourself? So firstly, I'd like to talk about 4 P's of gaining skill. This is an idea, once again, I've come up with, which is persistence. You need to stay strong and stay on your goal. If you can't do that, you're going to find it very hard to be able to do the dedication it takes to get good. Practice. It takes so much practice. It took me at least 3 months to be able to consider myself good at the game. So that was 3 months playing hours a day. Hundreds of games. Perseverance. Don't give up. At the start, you will lose well over 50% of your games. It's important that you don't give up and you keep trying. It takes a long time again to get good. Patience, as I've been saying, it really does just take a long time, but it does happen if you keep trying. Is it hard? Yes. It takes a lot of time. It is worth it, though. Because for me, Evict is a very welcoming, friendly community, and getting good enough that people recognize and respect you is a great way to find your place in this amazing community. Another important thing to help your journey is individuality. Try and stand out in some way, even if it's small. Standing out and being yourself is a great way to get better, as it allows your body to play more naturally and your brain to acclimatize easier to the game. It really does make a world of difference being yourself in Evict. I know myself, I play without plans. I just play off instinct, so I play to what my heart thinks is best. and that's quite literally how I got to be such a great player. Now, this will be just explaining some terminology used in this video. Firstly, schemes. Schemes are groups of blocks you can place down at once. Micro is the small stuff. So this is stuff like moving units around, placing reactionary defenses. All that is micro. Macro is things like unit factories, building eco buildings, and taking up. Question mark X. Basically, in Evict, a standard terminology is for resources or unit productions is X, and that might be something like 5x if it's got 5 locus factories, 2x if it's got 2 vanquish factories, might be a 2x vanquish, 3x locus. That's just how that is used. APM is your actions per minute. This is how many clicks and buttons you're pressing each minute. To some of the high tier players, it's a lot more important. Really wouldn't matter to most people. Evict or evicting is when you actually defeat someone. Basically, when you defeat someone, you have destroyed all of their hexes, so you've effectively evicted them from the game. From here though, you can run a command to invite them to your team. Trades. Trades are a term I use to explain unit interactions. How units trade basically determines what is the result from a specific interaction. Feet, sheet, e-heat, and oxide heat are all different forms of heating blocks, which is shortened. Tech. Tech is your level of eco. So in the early game, you might not even have oxide tech. In the mid game, you might have surge and carbide, and towards the end, you might even have phase. Eco is resources that you are producing and power. Build order is a pre-prepped plan that you will follow to help guide you on your game. This is not needed. I personally don't use one. Mixed belt. Mixed belt is when you have multiple different resources on the same belt. This can be useful or it can be harmful depending on the situation. Fistfight. Fistfights are when two players spawn really close to each other, and it dramatically changes how the gameplay works. Mixed bore. Mixed bore schematics are schematics that have inbuilt bores, which are basically schematics that have bores inbuilt into them so that you can place them directly onto resources and they will already have that resource being input. Mixed bore schematics have the same setup but are designed to be placed on multiple different resources. Useless piece of shit is the flux reactor. It is undoubtedly one of the least used for buildings in the game. Joke of a unit is Muru. Currently, it is probably the worst unit in the game in its current state. More on that later. Build order. So, again, I've already mentioned build order, but I just wanted to go over a couple more intricacies for build orders. They're usually very short. They don't usually go past the 10-minute mark. And I personally don't recommend using them until you get more advanced, but they can be a great way to help you find your niche. HP, DPS, and armor. HP is how much health the unit has, so how much damage it can take. DPS is how much damage per second it deals. Armor is the armor value of that unit. Armor produces damage by the value of the armor. So if you have a unit doing 10 damage and a unit with an armor value of 5, the second unit will only take 5 damage. Building materials. Building materials are the resources you are sending to your core to be used to build with. Forts are groups of defenses that are usually fairly high tier, but are just used to hold and defend cores. Core snipes. Core snipes are arguably one of the deadliest strategies in Evict, and they are done by using large amounts of air units such as obviates or averts to snipe vulnerable hexes. These can be prevented with defenses, more on that later. BVB. BVB is a very controversial thing in Evict, and most consider it illegal, but what it effectively is using buildings to attack other buildings. Defense is buildings you're using to defend your hexes. Attrition is a unique effect on Evict, as mentioned in the intro. There are several unique things, but attrition is the big one. Attrition is a rule where once your units are one hex away from a friendly hex, every few seconds they will lose a percentage of those amount of units. This is completely random as well. There is also a second part of the attrition that is triggered when cores are exploded. Any units in that hex have a 50% chance dying. If you have 100 units, on average you'll be left with 50. So those are all the main terminology used. As for prominent players, a few players I'll be mentioning throughout this video are Redeem, Taran, YSM, Saya, and Lara. So schematics. Evict's bread, butter, and blood. So schematics are very useful, usually fairly simple to use, but understanding why they are is very important to understand. So what are they? They're time savers. They allow you to do a lot of things at the same time. They allow you to do a lot of things without worrying about things going wrong. And you can always use layouts you yourself have spent hours optimizing. So what exactly are schematics? So as you can see in the image in the bottom right, these are around about a dozen or so examples of schematics, and each schematic is a layout of blocks with a set purpose, usually blocks that synergize with each other, and it's basically to just save time. Instead of having to place each block manually, you can just place all these blocks at once. So this is a more detailed look into what schemes actually are and looking at their inputs. So in the carbide schematic that uses oxide here, we can see it has boosted beryllium ores, and we can see where the water input is in that duct. Then we can see the graphite and carbide inputs here, and finally the actual output is where my cursor is. Understanding the outputs and inputs of schematics is very important to being able to utilize them effectively. Same here. We have the sand and graphite inputs, which are actually interchangeable. You can have the graphite be the bridge, or the sand be the router. Up to you. Depends on how you place it in the schematic. Beryllium, always into that bridge there. Hydrogen, into that pipe. This is for a 5x flow rate, one of the most prominently used schematics in late games. So here's a more controversial topic, which is the dark side of schematics, and it's just due to a bit of community hostility. It can be very bad when you make your own schematic, post it on the server, and many other people will see it and criticize you, and not really provide constructive criticism, but just be dicks. And this happens, and it sucks. There isn't really anything we can do about it. My advice is to just ignore it, or even try and understand it. It'll take a lot of time to get really good at making schematics. Some of my early schematics were God of War. But eventually you can end up making schematics like the one you see in the bottom right, which is one of my most proud schematics. And you should definitely try. Making your own schematics is a great way to express individuality in your playstyle. So, because small schematics, this was an idea given to me by Redeem to include. So, big schematics, they make more stuff for less actions per minute. Right, you're getting more value for your time, but they're more expensive. They take more to actually run, and they are harder to place. They're an bigger investment as well, because they're taking longer to set up. So you're getting your reward later on, versus small schematics. They make a lot less, but they use more APM to use. But they're taking less ego to set up and run, quicker to build, meaning they're a smaller investment. They're less risky than big schematics. So now we'll get into the part of this that has probably the most emotional connection to me, the story of Erekir Evict. And I believe understanding the history of the server provides deep insight into what led to the modern day state and why certain things are no longer done. This is just a brief overview, as the story itself would be worth a full video. So I'm just going to go over player generations and looking at the metas that occurred within those generations. Firstly, we had Yizum, YSM, Zaya, Tree, Zex, Zol, Vortex, Laro, many dozens of other players, and this made up the first era of players. So this was around about a few months after Eviction launched, at least the Erekir server did, and this is when I arrived in Evict as well. Many of these players, except Siren, Yizum, leaving the game or barely playing anymore after this era, sadly. And during this era we had the Quell meta, where we saw the first meta of missile-based units. And during this meta we also had the Locust meta for the early game and Quell meta for the late game. And during the Quell meta we actually saw a small uprise in Obviate usage, as they were fairly good counters. But then after this, we mainly had a Locust meta for a very long time, for the entire game. But then all of a sudden, Amphicus meta started. Just out of a few games between me, YSM and Sire, Amphicus were discovered and introduced as a very powerful unit, and they became the new meta. But very quickly they were considered a lame or boring meta, due to the nature of Amphicus and the micro aspect, so they were actually banned by the top players. So this was followed by the meta shift with the introduction of Ultimates. First introduced the power of Clowry, which soon became a meta unit and bring Vanquish into the spotlight. So Clowry, high DPS, pretty good defensive, and really fast and mobile, and Vanquish, really tanky, and they synergize really well together. And that made those units very prominent. So we also had Triple Anuf, who first joined during this time, Taran, who also joined, and these players also introduced the Evict meta. Also another noticeable player from this era was Stackerjack, who did a lot of really high tier forts. And now we have the current generation, comprised of half a dozen or so players such as Ara, Redeem, Aiden, Steve, Reverie, Distributor, and many others. And this came with larger meta shifts such as Tector and Locust, once again becoming more meta, and Obviates and Calaris even became meta. Calaris being probably the biggest one out of all of those. But games started lasting long enough to the point where Calaris could be relevant. So now we're going to be moving on to the more technical and advanced section of this video. Now, you don't need to watch this. This is not necessary to be good at the game. You can get pretty decent without this. This is going to be very specific. There's going to be a lot of information on each slide. And those of you who want me to go into more depth on any of these topics, I'll have a poll below the video where you can vote. So Will you learn most of the stuff when you're playing? Yes. Will it help you win if used properly though? Yes. Will you learn it easier from this video? Yes. So firstly, I'd like to talk about the stages to the game. So in the early game, we have a fist fight. Right, as we mentioned before, this is your close range fights. We have oxide. This is where you're first making oxide. Tungsten production first comes here. Your expansion cells. Your first locust factories are usually made. Usually locusts are the dominant unit on the early game meta. Building materials. This is where you're producing the materials you're going to be using to build in. You're using vents to power everything. Reaches are even sometimes used, and it's very micro intensive. Then we enter into the mid game, where we see carbide, surge, and thorium all being produced. We see the use of afflicts, titans, and musters on defense. We see T3 units start to be produced, a lot more T2 units, and Cleroy and Locust and Everts, and it becomes more macro intensive here. In the late game, we see phase and cyan. Sometimes you'll see cyan in the mid game, but for me, it's more of a late game resource. And during this phase of the game, you'll see T4s, T5s, a lot more T3s, and big forts. This will be very high tier, well-made constructions designed to resist hundreds of units. You'll see stalemates, so where two sides have forts on the borders and they're not really able to attack. You'll see drone-based defenses, and it actually becomes a lot more micro-intensive, interestingly enough, later in this game, as winning trades becomes very important. So now we'll talk about win conditions. What on earth are they? So win conditions are a concept based on a term from the popular game. Let's show you how. The idea of win conditions are for these to be game-defining units due to their offensive power, speed, abilities, or usage quirks. This is a significantly more controversial topic than most of the ones I'll be covering in this video, as it has not even been introduced to the general community as of yet. I'm the original creator of the concept, and these units I choose to fall into this category are based purely on my experience and my opinions. Units have win conditions, and why? Obviates. Obviates are very powerful in terms of their damage, very fast, and they're flying. This allows them to do core snipes, which makes them a win condition. Being able to snipe critical hexes is a game-winning trait, and that makes them a win condition. Avert. Averts, are in a similar vein to obviates, but being a T2, you can produce a lot more, a lot quicker. They're a little bit faster, they're a lot less deadly, but they're more HP dense. This makes them better versus turrets like Disperse, but worse versus turrets like Afflict. And this makes them a lot better at sniping a little bit lower tier hexes or early hex snipes, or running interference operations behind enemy lines. Amphicus. Amphicus in large numbers, very capable of overwhelming any turret. Enough Amphicus can fully stop and afflict bullets from even reaching the Amphicus. And they have really high range and pretty good damage, and decent enough HP to be used offensively. Calaris, which is often the strongest Erekir unit to most people, due to its really high damage and range, and when it's not firing, it has very high speed. It's very broken. There's not really any good counters to it. Redeem has designed a few forts that can survive 1 to 3 Amphicus using shockwave towers, but that's it. So Disruptive Wells, both of these units are basically the same thing. They're good for similar reasons to Amphicus and Obviates, as they can do core snipes while also having the offensive power of Amphicus. But they're also more mobile than Amphicus, so that makes them a bit stronger, but they're not able to hit air, which makes them very vulnerable. So they're not the best. They're mid-tier units at most, and then probably not the most common win condition you'll see. So units that can be argued to be win conditions or not win conditions, this is why I don't think they are win conditions. Claroi. So they have high mobility and high DPS, but they're just not strong enough versus static defenses. They are awful versus Titans, Afflicts, Sublimates, and even Lusters they can struggle against when they suffer defending units. And this results in them being very underwhelming mid to late game. And in the early game, win conditions, and in early to mid game, win conditions are more that one big punch unit. They're not really units like Claroi, where they're all-rounders. Win conditions are more designed to be aggressive, offensive units. Tecta. Currently considered the best tier 4. It is pretty much the best fighter, and really strong defensively. Which you'd think makes good defensively, but it really isn't. It doesn't have the HP or speed to be good offensively. And its shield ability currently isn't working well enough to be strong. Locus, similar situation to Claroi, but with more HP but less speed and DPS. This results in more attackers. This one able to destroy defenses before they're destroyed. Same vein to Claroi, mainly just used as more rounder unit. Conquer, Vanquish, and Precept. All these units have good PS and HP, but lack a lot of the DPS and speed needed. This just results in them not really being maneuverable enough to get those devastating blows before the enemy can respond. So now we'll look about some unit dynamics. We'll focus on 6 specific units. This is probably the most important topic in this section of the video. Firstly, we have Stealths, which are often the first made unit. It is pretty tanky, high armor, high HP, pretty good DPS, by far the strongest of TV of all the T1s, and the best unit for capturing cores. Locus, best T2 in 1v1 situations. It has low mobility, but very high HP, armor, and DPS. At least for its cost. The DPS stat sometimes is lacking, and sometimes it's too much. Just depends on the situation. It is able to nearly win 1v1s versus some T3s. It is an excellent frontline combatant. It's really good versus Claroi in low amounts. Strong versus Verts, strong versus all T1s. Pretty good versus Amphicus and Obviates, not so good versus Precepts. But it's a pretty good all-rounder unit, and that's why it's so meta. Because it can also fight Titans with pretty good returns. It's able to stand up against Afflicts for a little while. And that brings us to Claroi. Claroi are your fast, high damage attackers. They're great when synergized with Locus, because Locus can act as an tank for them, same as using Precept or Language with Claroi. This makes them very deadly when synergized with, and even deadly on their own due to their point defense, able to nullify a lot of units such as Verts and Obviates and Tecta. This makes them an incredibly strong counter for these units, and their high DPS and AoE makes them a great mid to late game counter unit. This brings us to Verts, which as stated before I consider a win condition. So they have very high speed, decent damage, but their high speed makes it very hard to react in time to their core snipes or using them for interference runs. They're awful fighters. It takes something like 4 Verts to win versus a Locus, and most likely more against a Claroi. But they can often carry a game despite this, just due to their core snipes. Obviate, probably one of the strongest units when microed correctly. It is able to quickly destroy isolated units due to its burst damage, and same for small squads, and really capable of sniping weakly armored cores with minimal losses, and this is something the Verts can struggle with. Sometimes just slightly armed claws can completely halt an overt swipe. Obviates, on the other hand, a lot more capable. This is due to having a very high damage per shot and pretty good movement speed on top of that. And then we have Tectors. Again, as mentioned in the Ring Condition section, these are probably the strongest 1v1 fighters on Erekir. For its cost, it is more than capable of taking on most units already. Your units can't beat a T5s. That's pretty fucking good. In large groups, it's really strong due to its high AoE. You can pretty much decimate any army, but its low HP and fairly slow speed makes it strong versus a Flex. It's alright versus Clusters, but it's really awful versus Flex and Titans. It just doesn't have the speed. It has really good range though, which is what makes it alright for Sublimates and mainly Lusters as well sometimes. So now we'll move on to defenses. When to use them and how. So Titans. Well, Titans are your standard defense. They're used to hold choke points, pretty early game defense, and pretty strong. Able to support large armies, but very bad by themselves. You really need to be supporting them with units such as Opus or Cloudrake because they are not very good single target damage. They're pretty tanky and have really good AoE, but they are really bad versus kit pushers. So when you have multiple armies from multiple directions and they can't hit air. And large amount of Titans in the late game can be a great counter to a lot of more spammy attack styles such as Amphicus, Lero, or Locus. Afflicts. Afflicts are something else. They're by far the strongest turret on Erekir, and they can be set up anywhere with just power due to E-heaters. This combined with high range and insane DPS results in them being the most broken turret on Evict. They have witnessed units with high armor luckily, so this is Vanquish and Precept mainly. But the compensation for their strength is their high surge cost and power cost, making them good only mid to late game. You can't really get them early due to the surge requirement. They're used a lot later on to hold choke points or defend hexes. They're mainly just a Titan combined with Disperse, but just made stronger. Clusters, the single target nightmare. Clusters melt through anything. Like any single target, they'll melt through in less than 30 seconds, even Conquer, dead in less than 30. This makes them incredibly powerful, and when considering their unique targeting AI, which is to target the unit with the highest max HP, that makes them even stronger, because they're actually going to get the value they're designed to get. But the problem with these deadly turrets is they lack AoE, so using swarms such as Clero or Locus can be a great way to counter them. But when synergized with Afflicts and Titans, they become really, really strong. So just versus the most underwhelming turret on this list really. It is very meh versus air, and only air, and lacks the DPS of Afflicts, Lusters, or Sublimates. It's good versus missiles mainly. It's capable of dealing with small swarms, making it good for defending low priority hexes. So hexes that don't have a lot of value on them from air-based core snipes. So you're looking at averts, obviates, and quells mainly it's good against, but it's just nowhere near what Afflicts, Lusters, and Sublimates are capable of. It is often good to just replace these with Afflicts or Sublimates as soon as your recall allows it. So, Sublimates. And this is an interesting one because they actually have two memos. With Ozone, they're really bad. Every unit except averts will outrange them, and they're really only good at destroying Amphicus and Quell missiles. But feed them Cyanogen, and they get pretty decent range, a little bit less than what a Luster would have, but their high DPS makes up for it, and pretty good PS. So this makes them very good at dealing with large amounts of units of any type, like good single target damage, good group damage, good anti-missile damage, high rotation speed, so able to deal with split lane pushes. So they're a great turret to use to complement Titans or Reflex. And now finally, probably the strongest defensive method is ozone bombing. So this is using containers filled with ozone and picking them up with your core unit. And basically, when these containers get destroyed, they explode. And they're very powerful, they can destroy almost T5 units in a single bomb. In fact, they can be used to destroy Citadel cores, even, in a single bomb. So they take a lot of skill to use correctly, but use it properly can win entire games, just refute entire attacks, stopping large pushes, and even just using them as a threatening weapon can really slow down an aggressive enemy. And so it's a really important skill for any highly defensive player. So, conclusion of it all. Evict is a hard, complex game. It can take months to properly master, but it's more than a game for me. It's a community and a place where I found home. It's a place I love and a place I hope stays for years to come. Me, Evict, and Ministry as a whole are part of who I am, and I'm so glad this positive community can exist in the modern era, despite how toxic League of Legends, most online communities are, and how corrupted our society is. Clash Royale, I would like to say to anyone wanting to get into Evict, take your time, take it slow, baby steps are needed, make your comfort zone, and only grow from there. Don't push yourself and feel satisfied with your small improvements. Dual players, I wish you the best of terrain, the luckiest starts, and the favour of RN Jesus. So, as I mentioned at the start of this video, I wanted to talk about balancing changes, hopes and dreams. So firstly we're going to look at buffs, and these are just buffs I believe would be good for the game for units, based on what I've seen from just witnessing gameplay and playing the game myself. So firstly, Mura needs to get an AoE buff or range buff to make them more viable versus other units, and as a support unit for extra DPS. Currently they just don't have the DPS, the AoE, or the range to really work as a support unit or a frontline unit. So small buffs just leading towards resolving this could result in a very interesting meta with Mura. Conquer needs a speed, HP, and DPS buff. It lacks all three of these stats, it's just not good. We can look at Rain, where it still lacks DPS, but at least it has some of the HP. It doesn't really have the speed either, but it has a little bit more HP than Conquer, and it's a lot more used than what Conquer is when it comes to using T5s on their respective maps. So I think Conquer needs to get some sort of small turret like what Dank has, and a speed buff and at least a HP buff to 24,000. Naven Axe as well, we see really high DPS with its meltdowns, and it's a really powerful unit and very tanky. Conquer just needs to be more like this. Precept, it needs some small general buffs. Vanquish needs a speed buff as well. Elude needs to actually get an attack speed nerf with a damage buff. This way they're stronger versus armor, making them more versatile, because currently with how many blocks on Erekir have high armor values, eludes just aren't usable. And because squads and disrupts all need to have changes made to their missiles to fix how low damage and easily counterable they are due to things such as duck spam. One dove can destroy an entire missile. They're just not worth using currently. And if it's a change as simple as making it so the missiles don't get exploded by ducks, and the same changes applied to Scave as well, that would be great, honestly. I think that would actually resolve a lot of the game's issues with these three units. Now we're going to go into nerfs. And these are, same as the last slide, these are in order of priority, in case any actual devs want to look over this. Hilarious. There's a lot here, and I've actually described the exact nerf I would like to see, which is, I don't want to see the range, damage, or speed changed. Well, I want to see speed changed, but in an interesting way. I think that after firing, it should lock in place for half a second, or even a second. Then move at half speed for another 2 seconds or until reloaded, and then at full speed. Right? The reason I want to have it lock in place is this makes it very vulnerable, right? It can't just go into a Titan's range and then pull out. It goes into a Titan's range, gets locked down, will take some damage, and then can pull out. And during this time, it's very vulnerable to things like obviates and the Titans. So I think this would make it more counterable, less strong for static defenses, and more actually interesting to use. Locusts and Stells both need a nerf. These units just outweigh the rest of the tier 2s and tier 1s due to their base stat and how cost efficient they are. So a small HP to nerf Stells and a DPS nerf to Locusts would most likely fix this issue. This could be as small as 5% for both, like 800 HP for Stells, turning down Locusts' HP by 1 or 2, but I've just placed it to give other units' turrets a bit more room to shine. The Row needs a DPS nerf, but to compensate, their point defense system could use a slight buff, as this is their main unique feature, that enhances their ability to still be usable well into the late game. I believe nerfing their direct damage to 21 and their AoE to 41.5 would be enough, and buffing the point defense to 30 to make them more unique to their role. This way they're worse versus units like Focus, but better versus units that actually fire the projectiles they're designed to counter. So, and this makes them a little bit better against Afflicts as well. Afflict, obviously this is going to be in here, so I believe build time nerf to begin with to 12 or 15 seconds because it's way too quick to build, making it way too strong for reactionary defense. Heat increased to 15 because it just doesn't use enough heat currently. This way it'll be a little bit more bulky and makes heating more expensive and less powerful. Oxide cost increased to 50, just a little bit more expensive. A health nerf to 3200, too tanky. You should have to use walls in combination with this, but you don't. A range nerf to 42.5 tiles. Currently its range is 43.75 tiles. It's way too big. Just a small tone down would work, and a damage reduction to 30 for the interval on frag bullets. Currently these do 35 damage, and it's just way too much. These changes altogether I hope make Afflict a more permanent, less reactionary defense, and is a bit larger space-wise, reducing the spammableness of the tower. The reduction to buildings should also be increased by a significant amount, probably to 80%. This is the damage reduction most turrets have against buildings. Titans need an area damage increase to 370, making them stronger versus these groups, but a small range AoE nerf. This way they don't get as far outside their radius, but they're still very powerful against walls. And to compensate actually, I want to also see a range buff. And the range buff is to make it better versus Galeris and other siege units, because that is what the Titan should be able to counter. I want to see it be able to do a little bit better single targets, so it's better versus Galeris, hence the area damage buff. And I just think overall this can make it a little bit stronger and a bit more permanent versus Afflict. I would also like to see the build damage nerf get increased to 75 instead of 70, and a health buff to 4500. Currently it's pretty close to that, but I just think a little bit more might help a lot. Sometimes a little bit of health makes a big difference, and I just think Titans just need to be tankier, especially with their price. And I didn't exactly talk about this, but I bet build speed reduction as well would be nice. And To counter the single target damage increase, a small fire rate nerf. This is just to make it actually worse versus shockwaves and clearing mainly. So disperse is currently useless for me due to lack of AoE. I think reducing the damage to 36.75. This would be a 12 damage increase, nearly a quarter of the turret's damage, but adding in a single pierce. So increasing the max DPS by nearly 50% would make a very significant difference in the turret's ability to counter storms. It can also use a price buff down to 100 XI and range buff to 39.5 tiles. That's just to make it better versus wells and missiles, as well as better at countering storms before they reach it. And the price buff down to 100 oxide, so it's currently way too expensive at 150 oxide. So, this segment originally was going to be earlier, but I just think it wasn't as important as other segments, so I wanted to throw it in at the end when I figured most people would have left the video, because it's not a very interesting segment, but it does have a lot of importance to it. So, let's get into it. Firstly, we'll see here I have a narrow labeled crab wall. So this is because this wall is only accessible by crabs. So, to get locusts or stealths into this hex, you're going to be going through this thin passage or this passage here, both of which very small, so very easy to defend. But this wall, very open, so crabs, so this is Cleveroid, Murrow, Amphicus, Tecta, and the Calerist, can very easily sneak into this hex from the sidewall. So that's a vulnerability to this hex, right? And we can see that because it's 1 tile wide, unlike this wall here where it's 5 tiles wide. At the top we see a wide open passage. This makes locusts and stealths very strong because their flow maneuverability isn't really affected here. So this makes Titans weaker, Afflicts weaker, Sublimate stronger, Lusters weaker, and locusts and stealths stronger. We see another crab wall here. So if I was to attack this hex, I would use a land assault from the open passage, and then to attack it with crabs from that 1 block wide wall. And then, as stated earlier, we can see this really thin passage that's 1 block wide, and this is where locusts or stealths would get stuck trying to move through. And this is just due to issues with the AI. So, why I want to point out terrain and stuff like this is understanding and utilizing terrain can be the thing that wins you an entire game sometimes. So looking at things like the location of liquids, looking at randomly generated walls, can make a big difference to how you defend a hex and how you plan out your attacks. So anyway, here are just the credits. There's a lot, I'm not going to read these out. Anyone who cares is allowed to read them, but one thing I would like to say is to Anukin, thank you for this game. I really appreciate it, and you did a great job on it. I honestly believe it's probably one of the best games I've ever played, and I'd like to see how it grows. I'm very excited for V8, as that's not out when I've made this video, and that's all. So